Welcome to the introductory concept of sentence structure. This is part 1 of the mini concept series on this topic. In this concept, we will learn about the differences between a clause and a phrase. We will also learn the differences between two types of clauses, independent and dependent. Then we will learn why it is important to know about clauses and phrases. So let's get started. Let's begin with understanding what is a clause. Mary is playing. In this statement, is playing is the action or the verb. Mary is the doer of this action and hence the subject. This statement is called a clause. So the two main features of a clause are: clause must contain a subject and a verb. This is an absolute must. And a clause must communicate an idea. Now let's see what is a phrase. Say at the end of this clause we add 3 related group of words in the park. Now this group of words is called phrase. Notice how it provides additional information about where Mary is playing. Thus, a phrase is a related group of words that appear together. This group of words cannot contain both the subject and the verb. And this group of words collectively provides additional information about any entity in the clause. Notice now, with this phrase, the entire statement becomes the clause. Review once again the differences between a clause and a phrase. So we now know what a clause is. Now let's understand the two different types of clauses, independent clause and dependent clause. The difference between these two clauses stems from the type of idea that each communicates. An independent clause communicates complete idea. For example, this clause is indeed an independent clause because it communicates a complete idea. An independent clause is also called as a main clause or a sentence. A dependent clause, on the other hand, communicates an idea but only a partial one. As an example, that has swings. This is a clause because it contains a subject and a verb. It communicates an idea. Something has swings. But this is only a partial idea since we do not know what has swings. Thus, this clause is a dependent clause. Now, when this dependent clause is added onto the independent clause Mary is playing in the park, we get yet another independent clause or a sentence. Before moving to the next slide, review once again the differences between independent clause and dependent clause, and notice the different parts of this sentence. Now let's understand why we need to identify clauses and phrases in a sentence. GMAT sentences are typically complex with a number of clauses and phrases. For the sake of this explanation, let's assume there are 3 clauses in this complex sentence. Now, since we have simplified this sentence into its individual clauses, certain tasks become very easy. This is because now we can concentrate on small pieces of the complex sentence one by one. This helps in better and effective understanding of the meaning. This helps tremendously in identifying the subject-verb pairs. Furthermore, once we have the basic subject-verb information, further focus helps us in better understanding the verb sequencing. By isolating the phrases, we can now make better linkages between modifiers and the modified entities. Not only that, such simplification aids in understanding of the less present in the sentence. And lastly, this information helps in easy detection of punctuation errors that are directly linked to sentence formation. All in all, by identifying clauses and phrases in a complex sentence, we truly apply the divide and rule policy that enables us to easily detect errors. Let's now review some examples of independent clauses. Read example 1. Notice the verb participates and subject Sally. Notice that this sentence communicates complete idea. Now, independent clauses may also at times begin with certain markers such as hence, therefore, in addition, for example. These markers are typically separated by a comma as shown in example 2 sentence. Notice that this sentence also communicates complete meaning and contains subject to a pair Sally is. Notice that this sentence begins with the marker moreover and is separated by a comma. Note that the list of markers is not exhaustive. There are many more such as additionally, furthermore, thus, etc. Review once again the typical structures of independent clause. Pay close attention to the types of markers that mark the presence of independent clause. Once again, independent clause always communicates a complete idea. That is the biggest identification mark for an independent clause. Now we will review some examples of dependent clauses. Note that since dependent clauses cannot stand on their own, we will place them with the corresponding independent clauses to create a complete sentence. There are two ways in which dependent clause can be formed. Relative pronoun begins the dependent clause and acts as a subject. For example, that occurs on 1st of every month. Here, that is the subject and verb is occurs. That is relative pronoun that refers to marathon. Other relative pronoun may be which, where, when, etc. Again, note that this list is not exhaustive. For example, whose, whom, who are also relative pronouns that can begin the dependent clause. Secondly, dependent clauses can be formed by using relationship words. For example, in this sentence, since is a relationship word that shows reasoning. This word marks the beginning of the dependent clause. There are other relationship words that represent reasoning, such as because, as, then certain words such as after, while, since, until express sequencing of events. Words such as although, while express contrast. There are certain other words like if, whether, unless that also mark the beginning of a dependent clause. Once again, this list is not exhaustive. These words are just few of the subordinating conjunctions that are mentioned here. In a sense, words like these begin the dependent clause that expresses a subordinate idea, an idea that is not at the same level as the main clause. Furthermore, also note that these relationship words do not always have to begin a clause. These may begin a phrase as well. For example, since 1990, Tom has been employed. Here, even though the marker since is present, it does not begin a clause. It simply presents a time frame. Similarly, the word after does not begin a clause. It forms a phrase after sunset to establish the time sequencing. Once again, review the two ways in which a dependent clause can be formed. Before we end this concept, we will apply the information that we learned about clauses and phrases on some statements. Read the statements that follow and select the right category for those. Once again, remember the end goal, being able to effectively solve SC questions. Good luck!